Okay, hi everyone. I'm Ravi Agrawal. I'm the editor-in-chief of Foreign Policy magazine, and I'd like to welcome you all here to a World Economic Forum session we're calling Return to War. It's nice to have you all here in the room in person. I'd also like to welcome our global audience that's listening in, watching in on live stream on WEF's website, also on foreignpolicy.com. Welcome to everyone around the world. Of course, after this discussion, after the first 30 minutes of it or so, I'd love to bring you in the room to take some questions from you. So raise your hands when it's time for that. Before I introduce my guests, today is day 91 of Russia's war in Ukraine, and it kind of feels strange to even say that out loud because it really normalizes the fact that war is back, to sort of play off the return to war title of our session today. And, you know, all of this just feels so unthinkable if you step back and take in, the last few decades. We all know the numbers. I mean, more than 6 million Ukrainians have been turned into refugees. Unspeakable human rights crimes have been committed, are still being committed. And the sad reality is that this war still has a whiles to go. It's very interesting as well to see how countries are responding in different ways. Of course, there's much talk of the West being united, of the return of Europe and NATO. But equally, on the other side of the world, there are many countries that either haven't condemned Russia directly or aren't sanctioning it. So in a sense, this conflict divides the world as much as it unites it. All of that we're going to dive into with our excellent panel. So let me go ahead and introduce them. Lynn Kwok, to my left, is based in Singapore. She's a Shangri-La Dialogue Senior Fellow for Asia-Pacific Security at IISS. Welcome, Lynn. To her left, we have Graham Allison. He's a professor at Harvard University. He's the author of several books, including Destined for War, in which he coined the idea of a Thucydides trap, which we're no doubt going to get to today. To his left, we have Ken Roth. He's the executive director of Human Rights Watch, and his group, of course, is playing such an important role in the war in Ukraine. And then to his left, we have Sir Lawrence Freedman. He's a professor emeritus at King's College London, seen as the Dean of Strategic Studies in the United Kingdom. That's on his Wikipedia page. Welcome to all of you. Lawrence, let's start with you. So the theme of WEF at Davos this year is history at a turning point. Ukrainian President Zelensky sort of reinforced that theme when he spoke to this forum on Monday, and he said that history is at a turning point. We mustn't let brute force rule the world. Just from an academic perspective, from your perspective, given how hard it is to sort of examine turning points while we're still in history, does this moment strike you as a massive historic turning point?
Yes, I think it is. And the problem is we don't know quite how it's going to turn. So it seems to me it's a sort of classic crisis, the proper use of the word, in that things can get an awful lot worse or an awful lot better. And I think we have to focus a bit on the getting better side of it and not just on the getting worse, because at the moment terrible things have been happening which have distressed us all. But there's also been the inspiring part of the Ukrainian resistance and fight back, which leads to one possibility, which I think is now more than just a possibility, which is that Russia is a diminished power as a result of this. So we've had years of great power competition. There's the US, there's Russia and China. It's a bit 2.5 now. Russia is already diminished. It's used up a lot of its power. It's lost, let's say, 3 years of tank production. But the main thing is Putin had built up this sense of menace and strength and strategic acumen, and he's blown that. This is clearly a blunder of the height. So we've got to look on that side of it as well as what happens if he succeeds, because I don't think he will, in his terms, succeed now.
Just very quickly, since you used the word diminish, Lawrence, there's been a shift in sort of Washington's public rhetoric on the war, initially trying to sort of, lead from behind, as it were. But in recent days, several officials have said they're actively looking for an outcome where Russia is a diminished power. Just very quickly, do you think that's a smart way for America to approach this?
I think we have to be very careful. I mean, my view, which goes for those who are urging Ukraine to accept the loss of a chunk of their territory, is this is not our war. We don't have war aims. We have aims in supporting Ukraine. They're the ones with the sacrifices. It's dangerous to set terms for the conclusion of this war that Ukraine might find difficult to meet. Just as it's dangerous for us to set terms that they don't really want to meet at all. So that's the principle upon which I start. But having said that, Russia is already diminished. It's lost its aura. And as this goes on, that will have more and more consequences for countries that have either relied on Russian power or feared Russian power. It's how much that'll work out, we'll have to see. But I think that's part of the trajectory we're on now.
So it's happening anyway. Lynn, let me bring you in. I often find so many of these discussions are very Western-centric, and it's really important to get a sense of how countries in Asia are viewing this crisis and where they see it developing in the next few months.
Well, I think it's safe to say that countries in Asia think what's happening in Europe, as horrible as it is, they consider it very much a self-contained event. So it might affect food prices, energy prices, but it's not something that's going to change the global landscape, and certainly not going to change the regional order in Asia. But I think that's wrong for several reasons. The first reason I would say is that the war has implications for a rules-based order, which has international law at its very heart. I think it's very important for us to remember that where international law is undermined in one part of the world, especially in so egregious a fashion, it is undermined everywhere. And we mustn't forget, of course, that Asia already has seen its own erosion of a rules-based order via various unlawful and coercive actions on China's part. So that's the first reason why I think Asia should be concerned about what's happening in Europe. The second reason I would say I'm worried about what is happening in Europe for Asia and its implications for Asia is that we are seeing the hardening of geopolitical competition around ideological lines. And, people debate the extent of Russia, the limits of Russia-China partnership, but that issue, the actual limits of the partnership or the alignment, is actually moot. What matters is that with the Russia-Chinese joint statement that was issued a little bit before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, with China's subsequent lackluster response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, that has allowed China to be painted with the same brushstrokes as Russia. So now the sins that Russia commits are now it's now viewed as, China's sins. And sometimes people are just being callous and they lump the two together, through this framing of democracies versus authoritarian states. And sometimes I think it's quite a cynical putting of the two together if we're looking to sort of undermine China's reputation because there's great power competition going on. So that's the second reason I'm concerned. The third reason I'm concerned is about how the war in Ukraine will actually impact alignment in Asia. So, you touched on that a little bit earlier. So we've seen, so we know India is a very important player in the Indo-Pacific. It's one of the 4 quadrilateral security dialogue partners, and of course India's position on the Russian invasion of Ukraine has put it at odds with its other partners in the quadrilateral security dialogue. And the question there, of course, is whether or not India's position is going to lead to divisions within the Quad partners, and to what effect. I think thus far we've seen that the United States and its allies have really, focused on the importance of the Indo-Pacific, the importance of having a robust partnership with India, and therefore they've sought to bury their differences. But of course, tensions may remain. The other impact on alignments, the other area where we might see alignments shift as well, and we don't know how, is alignment in Southeast Asia. And so I spoke a little bit earlier about the shifting geopolitical, about how we're seeing a hardening of geopolitical competition around ideological lines. Now that's going to affect Southeast Asia. Framing the competition as something of democracies versus authoritarian states, that makes Southeast Asia very uncomfortable, and it puts all of them in a pickle because many of them in a pickle because most of them are not liberal democracies. They are not, they might actually be backsliding democracies, or they might be authoritarian states. And they're also very important strategic partners for the United States and the West as they seek to defend and promote a rules-based order. So
there's a lot to unpack there. There's the China issue, the India issue, the democracy, autocracy issue, and I'm going to get to each of them over the next 30 minutes or so. Graham, let me bring you in. I'm curious for your take. You've studied China for so long. How do you think Beijing is viewing this crisis? Because, given the February 4th joint statement that Lynn referred to, and the fact that, her view that they're being sort of painted with a similar brush of sorts, are they now watching this play out and saying, oh gosh, this isn't good for us?
So 3 or 4 points. First point, what mostly people have not appreciated is that Xi Jinping has constructed with Russia a non-declared alliance that is operationally more significant than almost every other American alliance. So certainly more operationally significant than the U.S. relationship with India. Mm-hmm. So this is a thick relationship in all dimensions. And as he said at the February 5th opening of the Olympics, a, quote, no limits partnership.
Right.
So operationally, if I were playing, the Putin hand, I've got more support. So
right.
Will he stick with Putin through this? Absolutely. Absolutely. And if you want to watch, just watch every week what happens in the propaganda, what happens in the buying of oil. Will he buy every gallon of oil and gas and every unit of gas that Russia wants to sell? Yes. To whatever extent it shifts that way. If Russia becomes basically the resource base for supply, great. So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, I think as he's watched and you can be sure the Chinese study military operations more carefully than any other military. So the U.S. tries to do that well. The British try to do this well. But the Chinese actually go to school on wars as they watch what's happening. He's got to have some concerns. So first, the Russians have hugely underperformed.
Yep.
And that including with equipment, some of which he operates. Now, maybe they're just futzes and they didn't, take good care of the equipment or whatever, but still you have to look at that. Secondly, Ukraine has managed a level of resistance that surprised everybody, including sinking the flagship, the Russian flagship in the Black Sea, the Moskva. Well, could Taiwan have somewhat similar missiles? What would that do in terms of a military operation? Third, he's there watching and seeing how complicated a integrated military operation is. So when you're trying to integrate land, sea, and air and intelligence, that's a real exercise, and it needs to be practiced. So I would suspect that the head of the PLA is saying to, well, we need more practice. We need to work on this problem. Next, intelligence. So U.S. intelligence has clearly penetrated the Russian system in a way that has to leave everybody afraid. My goodness, if they know a week ahead of Putin whatever's going on at every level, maybe they've found some new methods to penetrate us. Mm-hmm. So I've got a list of a dozen reasons why, if I were an advisor to Xi, I would be saying, I think this is not a good time for a military operation against Taiwan. And since I think that's the concern, that's the fastest road to a war between China and the U.S., I think in that sense, that's quite positive, and we can be grateful that the Ukrainians have put up such a fierce and remarkable resistance, but we can also be grateful that a lot of what's happening, I think you have to, some of which is happening behind the veil. So what level of intelligence cooperation, more than you suspect? What level of military cooperation and preparation in advance? Probably more. What level in counter cyber? More. And I would say overall, that should lead to greater caution on the Chinese part, but I don't think it will lead to any substantial deviation from the proposition that this is my closest strategic relationship, and I'm sticking with it.
Ken, let me bring you in. We haven't touched on the human rights element here, the very real human cost entailed within Ukraine that continues, the war crimes that I know your group is documenting, others are as well. Talk us through at this point some of the concerns you have about the ways in which the world is handling this crisis.
Well, thanks, Ravi. Let me just begin by saying that, that the title of this session, Return to War, is a bit of a misnomer.
Yes.
It would be a surprise to the people of Tigray, a surprise to the people of Yemen, Afghanistan, Myanmar.
Right.
So it's there are other wars.
And I was going to bring this up because obviously this means that capacity is so stretched already, right? So
what's Tigray?
This is your reality day to day.
Yes. So, but coming to your question, I mean, first of all, I look at this war, and it is a big war. I mean, I'm not going to minimize it just because of the size of
it's
the
interstate conflict. So
yes. But I see this as one element of this contest, global contest between autocracy and democracy. And it shows what an unaccountable dictator can do. If Putin had, bothered to consult with anybody, this war probably would not have happened. And so it illustrates, the enormous dangers there. He doesn't even call it a war, and there's a reason for that.
Right.
We should be here talking about return to special military operations.
Right.
So, but the way he has now fought this war is horrible. It is typical for Putin, but he has ripped up the Geneva Conventions, ripped up international humanitarian law, which is designed to spare civilians as much as possible the hazards of war. This is the way he fought in Chechnya. This is the way he fought in Syria, and he's repeating the exact same thing in Ukraine. It's total war. It's treating the civilians on the other side as completely fair game. That is a war crime strategy. Now, the good news in this is that the world has responded to this with outrage. And so there's actually been a reaffirmation of those laws. I mean, if you look at the U.S. government, it has gone from hating the International Criminal Court. I mean, Trump imposed sanctions on the ICC prosecutor for having the audacity to think about maybe charging an American for torture in Afghanistan, let alone possibly indicting Netanyahu for the settlements. Biden has now said, well, wait a minute, maybe the International Criminal Court isn't so bad because it's the only way we're going to get to the Russian officials, including possibly Putin, who are directing this war crime strategy. So I do see a kind of a reaffirmation of international humanitarian law there. But at the same time, I mean, Lynn talks about the rule-based order. And usually what people mean by that is you don't invade another country, you don't seize islands in the South China Sea, fair enough. But that's just one element of international law. There's also international human rights and humanitarian law. And so, the same governments that say rule-based order, tend to be the ones like Beijing that have, imprisoned 1 million Uyghurs to try to get them to abandon their culture, their language, and their religion. There, I think we're at greater risk because what we're seeing now is this, desperate effort to build alliances against Russia. And the human rights elements of this rule-based order are at risk of being abandoned. I'm not going to say they're abandoned yet. So for example, when Mohammed bin Salman came up and said, you want me to pump more oil? Okay, start selling me the offensive weapons that I need to bomb Yemeni civilians. And by the way, get rid of those lawsuits against me in the United States for the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. Biden, to this point, has said, no, thank you. So that was the right answer. At the same time, it was just 6 months ago that Biden hosted this Summit for Democracy. And now he's inviting, and as Lynn notes, ASEAN to the White House, which is, for the most part, filled with autocrats. And it suddenly is more important to have, an ally, in that case against China, than it is somebody who's supporting the human rights element of the rules-based order. One thing I'm going to give Biden credit for, though, is that, despite everybody's understandable preoccupation with Ukraine and the horror that is going on there, if you get back to the threat, the contest between democracy and autocracy, the real threat by far is China. Russia still is a gas station with a military. It has zero soft power. Nobody wants to be like Russia. But China is promoting itself as, the superior model. They can have a long-term perspective. They don't have all the divisiveness of democracy. Now, it's not working out so well on COVID or the economy or various other elements, but they have the resources, the vibrant economy, to pose a real threat to the viability of democracy long-term. So I think that, despite the preoccupation here in Davos, the real long-term threat is China.
Can I make one footnote?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
So I largely agree with what Ken said, but I would start with Proposition 1, that only an autocrat like Putin could choose to conduct a war on Ukraine. And I remember in 2003, George Bush toppling Saddam and invading a country.
Right.
And I think that was a democratic country. So that doesn't work for me. And secondly...
But I don't think this war would have happened if Putin had consulted. I don't think this war, Ukraine, would have happened if there was broad consultation. The reason Putin went to such lengths to not call it a war, to censor discussion of it, to spread disinformation, to impose the threat of 15-year prison sentences on anybody who's anti-war, is precisely to prevent a discussion of the war.
I agree in part, but it seems to be the similarities are more substantial than the differences in that case, though I don't like to talk against the American line.
I'm not defending George Bush.
And I think the expectation that Americans would be regarded as liberators, and that this would be a short event, again reminds me.
Yes.
Didn't quite work out that way.
So, just as a
let me bring in Lawrence here because, and I will come to you, Lynn. We're sort of skirting around this whole democracy autocracy thing in terms of, aligning them against each other in terms of how you divide the world up. But also, as Lynn pointed out earlier, that makes many countries uncomfortable for a variety of reasons. Lawrence, what is a good way then of sort of either aligning or trying to sort of unite the world to stop what's going on? So
I think I agree with Ken that this demonstrates the danger of autocracy. The fact is, in 2003, there was a massive debate going on about the wisdom of invading Iraq, and everybody put their money on it, and Congress voted on it, and so on. It was a terrible decision, but it doesn't mean to say it was... so democracies can make terrible decisions, but they have accountability and they have redress and they can chuck people out of office and so on. I think I don't see this as a sort of a grand battle between autocracies and democracies. I think that's... again, using the Iraq analogy again, I did the UK inquiry into the Iraq war.
Right.
And so we said, well, what's the big lesson you learned from it? He said, don't do it again. And that reinforces Graham's point. There's a number of fallacies about the use of military power and what military power can do for you that is illustrated by this war. One of which is don't invade countries where you're not welcome. And that seems to me one of the most important. Secondly, don't assume that the first blow will be decisive, because as often as not, it isn't. And third, be aware that the unintended consequences of a war are greater than the intended consequences of a war. And if you keep those things in mind, then you don't do it so often. So I think, it reinforces the point that Graham made. And I hope it's not just in Beijing, is to play down what military power can do for you. And if that's one of the lessons, that will be a good thing. But the fact is, it's a geopolitical question, not just a rules-based international order question. And the geopolitics of it means that unavoidably, as with all of these sorts of issues, you find yourselves with uncomfortable characters because you need them at that particular time.
Right.
And so this is where the realists and the idealists have to work out a compromise between them.
We'll try and do that here. Lynn, do you think thinking of the world in terms of a framework of rules is a better way then to, especially for Asia and for countries there, to examine ways in which to respond?
Absolutely. I think that's the only. I think we had a session on ASEAN yesterday and the strategic outlook for ASEAN, and the point was made by one of the other panelists that, you know, ASEAN countries are so diverse, they have so many competing interests, there's nothing that keeps that they hold in common. But I think they do have something in common, and that's a principle. I mean, if they can focus enough, it's a principled rules-based order. And I think that's a very important unifying factor. It's what protects them against great power competition. It also protects them against each other. And it's also something that works both in favor of big countries as well as small. So I think, you know, focusing on principles and a rules-based order is important. I take your point, Ken, that, you know, international law isn't just about not invading another country and not seizing islands in the South China Sea. I think, you know, international humanitarian law is very important. Democracy is very important. The question, though, is, number one, is what's happening about imposing an authoritarian state? Is it about, is that the true reason for the dispute? If Graham and I had an argument about the color of his shoes, is that argument because he's male and I'm female, or is it just an argument about the color of his shoes where he happens to be male and I happen to be female? So is this just an argument between Russia and others because of a geopolitical issue? Or is it because Russia is an authoritarian state and the others are democracies? So number one, is it about this? Is it about authoritarianism and democracies? So number two, is that a helpful framing? And I do not think it's a helpful framing at all because it unnecessarily deepens divisions, not just between Russia and the rest.
Helpful in terms of outcomes, you mean?
Yes, in terms of outcomes. So is it an accurate characterization of the dispute, number one? Number two, is it helpful in terms of outcomes? And I don't think it is helpful because it unnecessarily deepens divisions, not just between Russia and the West, but also between China and the United States. You know, we started off with a trade dispute, then a technology dispute, and then we have all these other disputes, and now we're throwing in ideology and systems of government as well, and I don't think that's particularly helpful. It also, number two, it also alienates potential partners that could be useful to you in maintaining other aspects of the rule of law. And number three, it could be counterproductive. Yes, I want democracy, and yes, I think that international humanitarian law is very important. But am I going to achieve that by opening up strategic space to countries like China? And I think not. I think the important thing is to focus on what countries share in common. And it's hard enough to get countries, say in Southeast Asia, to focus on, you know, the importance of denouncing Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It's hard enough to get them to just focus on these broad issues of, don't invade other countries. Huh?
Many haven't denounced.
Many haven't. And so can we focus on that? Because that's really important as well. And so I am not saying that the issues you highlight are unimportant. I'm just saying that we can probably achieve them a little bit better by other means and by not opening up strategic space to certain powers like China.
Ken, I want you to jump into that. And as you mull a response, it's good we're having this discussion. It's good that you mentioned Yemen and Afghanistan. And, is there a sense from, all of Human Rights Watch's offices around the world, do you get a sense that there's a general fatigue as well with, the West telling us what to do, or with preaching, as it were? Do you get that sense as well? I mean, you mentioned Iraq.
Well, Ravi, let me answer your question, then I'd like to come back to Lynn's points. I don't see what Human Rights Watch does as the West telling people what to do.
Of course.
What Human Rights Watch does is enable people of a country to have a say in their fate rather than be subjected to the dictator of the moment. So we, assist local activists, but frankly, people of the country to assert their rights. And I don't have to tell them that they don't want to be executed, or that they don't want to be censored, or they don't want to be unfairly imprisoned, or that they don't want to be discriminated against. These are, universal desires. We try to support those people. We're not imposing them. So this is not a Western process.
Yes.
Now, in terms of, first Lynn asked the question, what is Putin's invasion of Ukraine about? I mean, we can do all the psychoanalysis and, what did Putin in his COVID isolation want? God knows. I think, obviously at some level he's trying to resurrect the Soviet Union. He thought that, 1991 was this tremendous blow. But I do think that an element of this is that Ukraine was emerging as a democracy. I wouldn't say it was there, But this sort of special animosity toward Ukraine really can be traced back to the Maidan revolt of 2014.
How dare they?
Yes, and it is, and it's partly, how dare they overthrow my favorite autocrat, but also it casts, a very negative light on the trend in Russia because, Putin just went through this Duma election where he completely shut down any opposition figure. He imprisoned Navalny because he had the audacity to come up with a system to figure out how do you embarrass United Russia, even though there are no real opposition candidates, how do you vote for the least bad alternative to United Russia? That gets him almost killed and imprisoned. So I do think that this, Putin is not delivering. He's increasingly insecure. People see through the kleptocracy. And he not only is crushing any prospect of civil society and independent, voices within Russia, but to allow this major Slavic country next door to be the opposite was intolerable. So I think that that's a big part of it. The last thing I just want to come back to is, Lynn, I grant your point that if the top priority is building a coalition against Russia, then it is unhelpful to talk about human rights because, of course, there are a lot of, dictatorial governments out there who you would want to be on the anti-Russia bandwagon. I don't think that's the ultimate aim. Okay. Yeah. In others, I think that, NATO's doing just fine supplying the Ukrainian military. Ukrainian military is doing just fine fighting. It's going to be a tough war, but there are other issues at here. And I don't think that we should, sacrifice, say, 1.2 billion Chinese and any prospect of their having independent freedom just so we can get Xi Jinping to kind of be more helpful in Ukraine. And I could say the same thing about any other country. I just think there are other issues here, and the top priority is not geopolitical alliance. It should be looking out for the welfare of the people of these countries.
Hand,
that's a good point.
You could also say that the top priority is peace and stability, global peace and stability. And in that case, perhaps it's also not very helpful to divide the world into two blocks, authoritarian states versus democracies, because then you have such a divided world. We have more than enough problems.
I want to push us towards solutions now. Lawrence very nicely put it in the beginning that we need to think also about good news and positive outcomes and how to get there. So let me push. I'm going to come to Graham first. In the next 3 or 4 months, are there any things that any options that you think of and say, gee, I wish the world was trying this to end this war?
So I know that this is not what Ukrainians ought to hear, but I believe that even though Putin made a horrible strategic error in invading, and even though Russia will be weakened for the long run, that this is a war that Putin cannot lose. So Bill Burns, the director of CIA, has made this argument very clearly. So either there'll be facts on the ground that Putin can live with, or he will escalate the level of destruction. I believe
this is somewhat along the lines of the argument Henry Kissinger made.
Exactly. I think it's
so
very...
you agree with that?
I do, because if you look at it, if he has to choose between an unambiguous loss on the one hand and escalating the level of destruction, he has many options for escalating the level of destruction.
Including nuclear weapons.
And even though for a group like this, it's totally inconceivable to imagine that we would see the explosion of a nuclear bomb, I think it's not unimaginable at all that he would make a tactical nuclear weapon strike on a military target, or God forbid, even a city. And he could threaten, if you said, what is he accomplishing? He'd say, this is the end of the war, or wait and see what a Ukrainian Nagasaki looks like.
Wow.
And you look and you say, what? Could he do that? He certainly has the physical capability to do that. Could somebody conceive of doing that? Well, excuse me, Harry Truman thought of that was a good way to end World War II with the Japanese. So it's not and all through the 60s and 70s and 80s, I worked on this. The U.S. planned to use tactical nuclear weapons early in a conflict in which Russian tanks were pouring through the Volga Gap to prevent them coming, getting to the channel. So I think so what's the good news in this? I think the good news may be that the fighting in Donbass sort of comes to stalemate roughly along the lines of where it is. Maybe Russia's controlling the entirety of Donbass, or maybe a little less than that. They have about 85% today. Mm-hmm. And they have the southern bridge that connects to Crimea up to the edge. Now, if at that point the war could stop.
Right.
And basically, either in a ceasefire or even a negotiated ceasefire, you don't have to have a final agreement. Zelensky will never, and he shouldn't, give up the claim to Ukrainian total territorial integrity. But Japan has not given up the hope of getting back the northern territories from the Soviet Union, or what's now Russia. So you can have a frozen conflict that goes on for a long time without people killing each other. Putin can spin it to his crowd as a victory enough for him. Ukraine will be the big victor in this because Ukraine is going to emerge as a vibrant, democratic economy.
I can see Lawrence there really disagree.
A dangerous argument.
Yeah.
I feel very strongly that this is a dangerous argument. We're getting far too ahead of ourselves. Russia is not being attacked. There are no tanks going across the border into Russia itself. It does not face an existential threat. Ukraine faces an existential threat. It's a genocidal threat if you use the definition of genocide. There is no reason for somebody who has not even had the nerve to call what he's doing a war, he called it a limited operation, a special military operation, to suddenly move to the most serious escalation you could imagine because he's being embarrassed. Ukrainians won't stop fighting. I mean, the biggest lesson we should learn from the conversations many of us have been having with Ukrainians over the last couple of days is they're not going to stop. We can say, you know, you've done really well, but they're not going to say they've done really well. They'll carry on. And the danger of these sort of arguments is we get ourselves in the position where we're 5 steps ahead of where we are at the moment, and saying, gosh, because of these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 steps, call it a day now. They won't, nor should we encourage them to do so.
Nor will they likely listen.
Can I make one small point?
I'm going to let you do one small comeback since that was a refutation, and then I'm going to bring in audience questions. The reason why I think it's so urgent to reach an outcome which will be horrible is that the alternative would be so much more horrible.
The alternative is Russia losing a war.
That the feasible alternative, in my view, is so much more horrible that you have to at least ask yourself, what will the world be like? What would it be like if Putin should conduct one nuclear strike and a second nuclear strike? And as President Biden has said from the beginning, and as Stoltenberg said here yesterday, you have 2 competing objectives. One is Ukraine survives as an independent country. 2, no war with Russia.
And that's why we haven't joined in the war. That's why we're not fighting the war.
Exactly.
Ukrainians are fighting it. We're not fighting it.
Right.
Ukrainians are fighting it.
And bravely and courageously and successfully. But I believe that if it gets to a point where there's an unambiguous choice between Putin fails, whereupon Putin's regime is gone, his life is gone, everything he cares about is gone, for him that's existential, and he has an alternative.
Okay, time to bring in our audience. I see a hand raised over there, and then I'll come round. Is that's Samir Saran from India?
Yes, hi. I think both of you are right. And I say that I say this with all seriousness because I do believe that if you were to pursue and be creative in the pursuit of peace, as Graham suggests, and we must be, you require a strong hand, and for that you require, Ukraine to continue to strengthen the negotiated outcome that might be possible in a few days. But my question to both of you is is Russia likely to accept defeat? And accept defeat with 4,000 warheads in its arsenal, is defeat an option for Russia? And what could that creative strengthening of hand at the one hand, and coming up with a carving up of a frozen conflict, what could the world do to get there? Besides the emotionally charged Europe, what could the world do to get to that place?
Can I make two points? I mean, first, the world is going to get hit by this war. And you know, what caused the Arab Spring and all the wars that flow from that? High food prices, one of the factors. So this is not a contained thing. This is going to involve everybody, and everybody is concerned with it. And that's a factor that should be reminded of with Putin as well. Secondly, there will be diplomacy at some point. It'll come in. I'm certainly not precluding it. What I'm precluding is setting war aims for Ukraine on the basis of our fears of hypothetical possibilities and contingencies which haven't yet arisen when the circumstances will be so uncertain. We're just getting too far ahead of ourselves. Russia is not at risk from this war, other than the fact that, I mean, Putin may be, but Russia itself, nobody is entering Russia to occupy it. And you know, that's the difference between all the Fulda Gap and so on scenarios that we grew up with.
I just want to let Ken jump in as well. If
So
No, let Ken.
but just because of the question. So who is at risk in this? Putin is at risk. Who is Putin? Everybody, the person you've described so far that got us to this point. Will Putin do everything required that he could do for his survival? I believe that he will.
You should.
And we have to take it seriously.
And that answers Samir's question.
I'm not forgiving for setting the.
I want to let Ken jump in.
Okay.
You guys are arguing this.
We have to look at what the future is.
There's an after party.
Okay, I mean, you guys are arguing this as if, you know, Putin is at the end of his long table just dieting on his own.
Yeah.
The X factor in this is the Russian people, and we're not bringing that into the conversation. And I, you know, that has bothered me about the discussion here in Davos, because, you know, you listen to the Ukrainians and they view the Russian people as the enemy. You know, I had a conversation with the Ukrainian official yesterday. They all think Crimea is part of Russia. They're all the enemy. There was a minister today said, you know, it's great that all these companies are pulling out. You know, the companies have nothing to do with, you know, supplying the Kremlin or paying for the military operation. You know, why is Starbucks pulling out of Moscow, you know, helping in this? And I fear that, you know, this approach of all Russian people are the enemy is undermining potentially the best ally that the Ukrainians have. Because, you know, why was Putin so careful not to let the Russian people know about this? Why is he still trying to hide what's going on in Ukraine? Because he understands that there's going to be a backlash. You know, Human Rights Watch, we are doing everything we can to channel information in Russian into Russia. You know, via Telegram, via YouTube. 10% of the Russian population have downloaded VPNs. And there have been anti-war protests in 150 cities across Russia, despite the threats of 15-year prison terms. So my view is that, you know, it's not Putin at the end of the table. Putin cares foremost about avoiding a color revolution. He's terrified of that. And if the Russian people can be informed of what's going on here and be treated as potential allies rather than as the enemy, that can change Putin's calculations. So we're not talking about, you know, what is this, you know, lone mastermind going to decide at the end of the table.
Fascinating. Let's take some more questions over there. The gentleman, yep.
To Lawrence Freedman, I'm Michael Jarlen from Denmark. I was wondering, you started by saying Russia, what was your hope that Russia would be diminished as a power? What if Russia wins? Where does that lead us to?
Before you answer, Lawrence, are there any other related questions? You're putting up your hand there. Let's hear that as well, and we'll try and take them together. I'll come to you later, comments later. So Lawrence, go ahead.
Well, I mean, I don't think Russia can win now. I mean, in terms of the objectives that they set for themselves, in that sense, they've already lost. If they you saw what happened when people thought they might win. You get NATO energized. You get people talking about actually improving their defense budgets. You get Sweden and Finland talking about joining NATO. You would create a great sense war atmosphere within wider Europe, and that would be very dangerous, because if Russia had succeeded, then everybody's looking for the next step. If it's on the rampage, where do they go next? Now, I think that's why what the Ukrainians have done is a sense of service to us, because they've pushed Russia back, and the Russian army are going to take an awful long time to recover from what they've just been through. And boy, have they got some lessons to learn about military competence. So that's why I think in that sense it's a crisis. And you know, if we will, I would not encourage the Ukrainians to talk about damning all Russians, or talk, you know, they've got to be careful about Crimea. But the fact is, as things stand, where they are at the moment, they're in today a real difficult struggle in the Donbass. It's on edge, and it's going to take a long time. We've got to get used to that. This is going to take a long time to sort out. And while that's going on, we're a long way away from Putin being absolutely sure he's lost. That's why it's at a crisis point. It's a sensitive point. And that's why I get nervous about getting so far ahead of ourselves that we're worrying about things which I don't see how any Putin interest is served by a nuclear war. If we do that, then it leads us to come backward and say, oh, better stop now.
Okay, I'm being told we're out of time.
Oh.
Thankfully, this is Davos. We're all here, and I'm getting the sense that there's going to be some vigorous fighting and debating after this discussion. So let's keep it going. Thank you to everyone here. Thank you to our global audience as well listening in, and to our panelists.